Hello and welcome. Today we are talking about something that's probably caught your eye recently, maybe even given you a moment where you kind of paused. We're talking about the Gen Z stare. That phrase is everywhere now. So if you've encountered that neutral, often unblinking facial expression from a young person, some content creators describe it as this perfectly deadpan response, almost performed neutrality. But then for older generations, it can feel a bit unsettling, maybe even rude. That's the reaction we're seeing a lot. Confusion, sometimes offense. So what is this Gen Z stare actually is? What's behind it? What can psychology tell us about the deeper meaning? Let's see from the latest research, viral observations, and expert takes. And this isn't just like random anecdotes. This discussion has been huge across social media. You had those TikTok compilations really blowing up around mid-2025. And then serious dissections by places like Forbes or NPR. So the sort of working definition from these sources is it's this long, expression-neutral gaze, characterized by wide eyes, often a kind of slack jaw, and very little, if any, vocal response. You see it everywhere. Service encounters, Zoom meetings, even on phone calls apparently. So for today, our goal here is to get past those quick judgments and really try to understand it. But first, you may ask, isn't this something we've sort of seen before? Like, are we just replaying an old generational story here? That's a really important question to ask, because it feels like every new group, every cohort, they're going to become a target for some kind of moral panic. There is a pattern. Remember Gen X? They were the slackers. And Millennial, they were all entitled. That label stuck for a while. And now Gen Z is being called expressionless. It really seems like these stereotype cycles, they just repeat, maybe every 20 years or so. It does seem that way. Older adults judging the new adults by the standards they grew up with. So that brings us to a key psychological point mentioned from the sources. The Gen Z stare is not a clinical diagnosis. It's just a phrase that popped up from shared experiences from viral stories, not something out of a medical book. Treating it like a syndrome or some disorder risks pathologizing, normal communication quirks. It's really more of a modern shorthand, a way to describe a communication style that simply feels new or maybe unfamiliar to older adults. So if it's not a disorder, what is driving it then? Our sources point to a couple of major cultural shifts that might explain this look. And the first one is life through a lens. The impact of screen time. We can't really overstate it. Today's teens, emerging adults, they spend staggering amounts of time looking at and being looked at by cameras. Major psychological organizations like the APA, they've noted that over 1/3 of American teens report 5 or more hours a day just on social media. And that's just social media. Doesn't even count gaming, streaming, homework on screens, all that other stuff. So what's the connection to the stare then? Well, it's linked pretty directly to weaker face-to-face emotion skills and fewer spontaneous smiles, which makes sense if you're used to a screen. And some studies using automated facial coding, they actually show adolescents as kind of curating this rest-neutral pose, almost practicing it in order to avoid awkward freeze frames on video calls or unflattering photos. And there was another study in 2023 using EMG to measure facial muscles. It found diminished activity in the zygomatic muscle. That's the main smiling muscle among people who frequently use video calls, which means the screen time is literally training faces to be neutral. That's what the research strongly suggests. It trains a kind of baseline neutrality. And then there's the second big factor our sources point to, the mask years, the pandemic. It had this significant and maybe often overlooked impact on facial communication. During all that time with mandatory masking, kids basically had to learn to read emotions almost entirely from the eyes, just the upper face, because that's all you could see. There was a 2024 study, actually, that followed preschoolers for a whole year while they were masked. They saw a significant improvement in recognizing happiness and sadness when they could only see the upper part of the face. They got really good at reading eyes. They adapted. So what happened when the masks came off? Well, for many students, they kind of kept the habit of holding the lower face still, especially if they felt uncertain or awkward. And think about it, for a generation that largely went through puberty during lockdowns, a flat mouth, a still lower face, it just became a sort of baseline expression for many. So screens training neutrality, masks emphasizing the eyes. So are there deeper psychological things going on here too? Like, how does this affect how young people see themselves or interact? There's another layer. Think about endlessly scrolling through thousands, literally thousands of faces every day online. It can genuinely start to blur the line between a living, breathing person and just a digital image. And this links to something called self-objectification. There is solid research on this, Big meta-analysis of like 68 studies. It confirmed that heavier social media use predicts higher self-objectification, which means users increasingly started viewing their own bodies, almost like objects, things to be displayed for others, like a profile picture walking around. You start seeing yourself as a static thumbnail. And if you see yourself that way, it makes a certain kind of sense to minimize uncontrolled expressions. You want the photo to look good, or at least neutral. And that habit, that internal feeling, it can seep into your offline interactions too. Other people might start to see more like images to be scanned, rather than partners to actively engage with, which would naturally lead to less animation in your own face. And then there's the anxiety piece. We know anxiety is surging among young people. The data's pretty stark. One analysis published in Frontiers in Psychiatry showed anxiety disorder rates in 10 to 24-year-olds have climbed 52% since 1990. It's a massive increase. And when your nervous system is constantly on high alert like that, showing emotion, it can actually feel quite risky, vulnerable. So holding back expression is a defense mechanism. We saw this in a brain activity study using ERP, which measures brain responses. Socially anxious participants in this study showed they used extra brain power trying to figure out other people's smiles. But at the same time, they actively suppressed their own facial muscle activity, their own smiles. But why? The researchers concluded that staying neutral in those situations, it helps conserve emotional energy, and it lowers the perceived odds of looking foolish or being judged negatively. That makes a sad kind of sense. And then you add the whole social media obsession with being real, with authenticity. Many teens say they'd rather look reserved or even blank than flash a smile they don't genuinely feel. So authenticity equals neutrality sometimes. In that context, it creates this sort of poker face norm, a kind of strategic neutrality, which older generations might totally misread. They see it as disengagement, apathy, maybe even rudeness. But the research suggests it's often more about self-protection in a world that feels like it's always watching. A self-protective response in a hyper-connected, often overwhelming world. So it sounds like there's a lot of adaptation happening here, complex stuff. But are there any upsides to this expression for Gen Z, or is it purely a communication barrier? Interestingly, our sources do point to a few possible upsides for the person doing the staring, so to speak. One is simply energy conservation. Maintaining a mild, neutral face literally uses less emotional fuel. That can be handy during a long shift at work, or maybe during draining social events. Another potential use is boundary setting. That stare can actually be used sometimes, consciously, as a form of gray rocking. It's basically making yourself emotionally unresponsive, like a dull gray rock. It can be a way to deflect rude customers or unwanted attention without needing direct confrontation, like a nonverbal back off. And finally, there's a sort of digital alignment. A look kind of matches how Zoomers often convey nuance online, maybe with a specific emoji or even just the timing of a response. So it's like a real-world equivalent of a thumbs-up emoji. In some contexts, maybe a neutral acknowledgement. But there's downsides too. Misreading those signals can really derail important things like job interviews or collaborating effectively on a team. There's also the risk of emotional suppression. If you're constantly holding back your expressions, it might actually reinforce avoidance cycles, especially for people already dealing with anxiety, making the anxiety worse potentially. And lastly, it can lead to social withdrawal. If people around you constantly perceive you as aloof or uninterested because of that neutral face, they might pull back, which could shrink your social network. People who crave warmth or connection might just withdraw. So it's a real double-edged sword. So knowing all this, what can you do if you're Gen Z or if you interact with Gen Z every day? Parents, teachers, managers, how do we bridge this gap and move towards a better understanding and interaction? The research and experts offer some really concrete advice, maybe starting with tips for Gen Z themselves. One practical tip, try recording a short conversation on your phone. Play back with the sound off. Just notice what your face is communicating. Then maybe experiment gently. Try adding a small nod, maybe a little half smile, or just raising your eyebrows slightly during conversations. See how it feels, how it looks. Small adjustments, tiny adjustments. Another thing, if there's a pause in conversation that feels awkward, try narrating it. Just say something simple like, give me a second to think about that, instead of just silence. It stops the silence from potentially being seen as like stonewalling or disinterest. Treat small social risks as practice, like a quick, "Morning, how are you?" It doesn't take much energy, but it can warm the air a little bit. Small steps. Now for the other side. For parents, teachers, managers interacting with Gen Z. For them, a few key things. First, model clear micro-expressions yourself. A relaxed, genuine smile, when starting a meeting, for instance, can set a positive tone. It gives a neutral listener something they might unconsciously mirror. Lead by example. Second, if you notice an issue, give explicit feedback, but do it privately and kindly. Many young employees genuinely don't realize their default face comes across as cold or icy. They need to be told gently. They're often unaware, often completely unaware. Third, help translate digital cues into live ones. Explain that you know while a thumbs-up emoji works online, a slight head nod can do the same job in a face-to-face meeting. Bridge that digital gap. Fourth, address potential underlying anxiety directly. Instead of labeling silence or neutrality as laziness or attitude, maybe point towards mental health resources or check in about workload. Address the root cause, not just the symptom. And finally, a great practical resource for everyone, parents, educators, young people themselves, is the American Psychological Association, the APA. They have a health advisory specifically on social media use in adolescence. Really worth reading. Okay, before we wrap up, let's hit those couple of frequently asked questions that always seem to come up. First, does the Gen Z stare mean disrespect? Is it deliberate? Good questions. And the short answer based on the sources is no, it's usually not deliberate. As we said, most young people are unaware they're even doing it until someone points it out. So, not intentional rudeness, and it typically doesn't signal disrespect either. That blank look is often more about the starer's own self-protection, not about offending the viewer. So the chill someone might feel, that feeling of being iced out, experts suggest it often stems more from the viewer's own rejection sensitivity, basically a heightened fear of being disapproved of or rejected. So, it's partly our own reaction interpreting the neutrality. And the last common question, will Gen Z just grow out of it? Is this just a phase? It's highly likely yes. Expressive range tends to broaden naturally with age and experience, especially things like navigating workplace dynamics. It's probable they'll eventually shed this specific generational label, just like previous generations shed theirs. So wrapping this all up then, when we really look at it, the Gen Z stare isn't some sign of moral decline or the downfall of communication. It's way more complex. It seems to be this intricate adaptation to a world full of cameras, the lingering effects of the pandemic's mask years, plus the rising tide of anxiety, and these new evolving rules about authenticity, especially in a hyper-connected digital age. And just understanding that context and having this discussion or talk, it can really help shift that feeling of irritation or confusion towards, well, maybe empathy. I think that's the goal. And it really helps to bring it full circle, back to that historical context we touched on earlier, the generational cycles. History just clearly shows us that every single generation's quirks, their ways of being, have sparked some form of moral panic in their elders. It's a repeating pattern. And listen to this quote. This is from Reverend Enos Hitchcock, writing way back in 1790. He wrote, "The free access which many young people have to romances, novels, and plays has poisoned the mind and corrupted the morals of many a promising youth." So if you worry about new media corrupting the youth, then it's not exactly new when you hear something like that from over 200 years ago. It kind of proves that the Gen Z stare is really just the latest chapter in a very, very old story about generational differences, perception, and how we react to change. And that is all I have for you today. Thank you for sticking around. My name is Chet. See you next time. Bye.